Hi, this is Tom Needham, and you are listening to The Sounds of Film. And joining us on the program today is acclaimed director Erik Nelson. We're going to be speaking about his new film, Daytime Revolution. Daytime Revolution is a new documentary about the unforgettable week in 1972 when John Lennon and Yoko Ono took over the Mike Douglas show and beamed the revolution directly into the living rooms of over 40 million Americans. Now, you probably know Eric's name. He's done a lot of work through the years. He's a multiple Emmy and IDA award winning filmmaker. He's produced and directed a wide range of feature documentaries. Um, he was the executive producer on the U.S. versus John Lennon, an important film, which we'll discuss. But he's done so many other things, including many films with Werner Herzog. Um, Erik, I'm so excited to speak to you about this film. Thanks for coming on The Sounds of Film.
Oh, my pleasure.
So, well, I mean, let's get right into it. How did you come up with this idea of taking the footage, the famous footage from the Mike Douglas show, in which John Lennon and Yoko were on for a week, and turning that into a film?
Well, I always had this subcutaneous knowledge that uh, this week happened, and I vaguely remember at the time it happened. A 16-year-old me remembers it, though I don't remember watching it. But uh, you ask how you get an idea. It just seemed the concept of John and Yoko Lennon hijacking and co-hosting a week of a daytime talk show obviously sounded fascinating. And I was able to obtain a copy of the five shows that were released back in 1998 on, wait for it, VHS tape. And when I watched the raw shows, which were 90 minutes long times five, I was very excited. I had the same reaction that I had when I screened some of Timothy Treadwell's footage for Grizzly Man, of this. Wow, this is incredible. There's some very interesting things going on. Needless to say, John and Yoko on Mike Douglas is a lot less uh, alarming than Timothy Treadwell, but it had that same appeal to me, and I just knew there was a film lurking inside of this event.
For those people who are not familiar with the Mike Douglas show, can you just tell us a little bit about the program?
Well, back in 1972, it was the most popular daytime talk show in America. It reached about 40 million people. So a huge audience of mainstream Americans, mostly housewives, but who knows who. The silent majority basically watched the show. And Yoko Ono had done an appearance on the show. Mike was very open to guests and avant-garde guests. And she saw that that show would provide an interesting platform for she and John, who at that moment in time were intensely political. They were hanging out with Jerry Rubin and in the Village and David Peel in the Lower East Side and doing all of these very committed radical appearances. And she had the idea of bringing that happening to this platform, basically a happening, East Village happening. It's going to take place in America's living room of the Mike Douglas show.
I mentioned earlier that you were the executive producer on the U.S. versus John Lennon, an amazing piece of history. Can you just remind our listeners, maybe who are not familiar with that story, and then kind of tell us a little bit about what the connection is between your current film and that movie?
Well, the U.S. versus John Lennon documented the I think, 4-year effort of Richard Nixon and Gerald Ford to deport John Lennon, who was not a citizen. He wanted to be a citizen of America. He wanted to live here. He wanted to dedicate his life to America. And that was at odds with what Richard Nixon wanted. And the reason Richard Nixon wanted John Lennon deported was because of these shows. When Lennon and Yoko not only took over the airwaves, but made such a convincing case for their utopian vision, Nixon saw it as a threat to his reelection, which was taking place in November of that same year. And to put things in context, these shows aired in February of 1972. In June, just 3 months later, Nixon would break into the Watergate, another paranoid act, because he was convinced that the Democrats had something on him in their files. And we all know where that went. Sadly, Nixon would win the election in November, winning 49 out of 50 states. He crushed George McGovern. But back in February of that year, Nixon didn't know, and Nixon was sufficiently paranoid to sanction a break-in into the Watergate, and John Lennon and Yoko Ono being, quote, card-carrying subversives on daytime television. That posed a threat.
It really is amazing. People hear today that the government was interested in John Lennon and they were worried about his message. But this show, as you mentioned, really does capture what they were worried about. Whether one likes him or doesn't like him, what they did during this week is pretty remarkable. Can you share with our listeners the range of guests and topics that were covered during this week when John and Yoko took over the Mike Douglas show?
Well, they brought to this primetime platform, they brought Jerry Rubin, founder of the Yippies, total crazed radical, one of the Chicago Seven. Bobby Seale, another member of the Chicago Seven, the guy they put in chains, if I believe, of the Black Panther Party, chairman of the Black Panther Party. They brought on avant-garde rock and roll, Yoko doing conceptual art pieces, this whole galaxy of weird and wonderful things. Ralph Nader was very active, and Ralph Nader uh, presented a manifesto for youth to vote. Ralph was all about getting the youth of America to care and register to vote. Bobby Seale was all about you can't solve poverty without feeding people. And that's what the Black Panthers were all about at that moment in time. And Jerry Rubin was Jerry Rubin, very outspoken, radical. But all of these people were very prescient in what they were saying. And that's what attracted me to the material. It hasn't aged. And I have to say, that watching these, I was a lot of times I'm thinking, God, if only they'd listened, 50 years ago, we might be in a better place. We might not be facing an equally apocalyptic election like we are in the next month.
What are some of the issues in the film that you feel are so pertinent today that are talked about during that week when John and Yoko were on the Mike Douglas show?
Well, Yoko at one point makes a convincing argument. Why aren't women being pushed to vote? And she almost gets a chuckle from Mike Douglas. So women voting. Nader is all about you, the youth of America registering. John Lennon says very clearly, our vote matters. Even one vote makes a difference. Please vote. That's pretty prescient right now. I mentioned Seale about a grassroots approach to poverty, feed people first and discuss the politics later. Um, you know, the the list goes on and on and on. I'll let you see the movie to see all the other things. It's a nutrient bath of great ideas and thoughts, and very entertaining as well. And our idea was to present it in the way that it went down, distill the 90 minutes each, the 7.5 hours of footage, down to perhaps 70 minutes of content, all sort of moderated by people who were in the studio 50 years ago, guests on the show who hadn't seen their appearances in 50 years. We tracked them down, and they contextualize what they did. So they kind of place you in the moment. I like to say that I'm not a documentary filmmaker in this particular project. I'm really in the transportation business, trying to bring people back in time to 1972 and put people forward in time from what they were saying into our future today.
It's similar to what you did in Grizzly Man, where you had all this footage and you allow a lot of the original footage to tell the story. Why was this an important decision for you to include so much of the shows and to only use the people who were on the shows to talk and give their thoughts about the time?
It's an honest, unmediated approach. If you're making a case that this material was important, why not show the material? You don't need me telling you that it's important. Present it. And I felt that the purity of having the people who are actually there, who in all cases have lived great lives since then and are all doing interesting things today, the juxtaposing of the people today, the guests today, and their appearances then would just be a very straightforward, unmediated approach. Let the material speak for itself. And I hope we succeeded in that.
Absolutely. This show is the sounds of film, and this is really the perfect movie for this program. You have some very unique musical and rare performances in this film. Everyone from Mike Douglas singing to John Lennon to other avant-garde positions, performers rather. Tell me about the music and why it's such an important part of the film.
Well, the music, you have a fantastic version of Imagine, which a few months earlier had been a big hit and made a big impact. You can't cover John at that period without showcasing a tremendous performance of Imagine. There's a one of a kind, only time it ever happened duet with John Lennon and his hero and mentor, Chuck Berry, that's pretty extraordinary. We have an incredible rendition of that well-known John Lennon classic, Michelle, by Mike Douglas, which we find amusing and charming. And we have a biofeedback where they actually strapped electrodes to the heads of Mike Douglas, Chuck Berry, John, and Yoko, and fed back their brainwaves into a synthesizer for an electronic music concert. So it doesn't get much weirder than that.
And how did audiences respond? Like in your research for this film, I know it was very popular. You mentioned over 40 million people watched it. This must have been like unbelievable for that audience at that time to get
I think it was. I think it blew people's minds, which was entirely Yoko and John's intention. It certainly had an impact on Richard Nixon. Anything that led Nixon to being more paranoid than enacted what turned out to be Watergate and got him out of office isn't necessarily a bad thing, though the deportation was a terrible burden for John Lennon. But it galvanized a lot of things. I don't think Nixon won 49 out of 50 states, so I don't think that it changed a lot of hearts and minds of middle America. But the very fact that the things went out there, and it speaks as what America was capable of and should be capable of today. Mike Douglas, a very mainstream centrist guy, put and was comfortable putting all of these radical ideas in his living room and projecting it out to America. That's significant. Attention must be paid.
Tell me about Mike Douglas. As you said, he was perceived to be this very mainstream type of guy, and most of the show was, but he would on occasion, like in this particular case, have John Lennon and Yoko and all their friends and guests on together. And how did this come about in terms of like Mike Douglas being open to doing this? Like it just kind of goes against what a lot of people's perceptions of who Mike Douglas was.
Well, understand, John Lennon was John Lennon. He was one of the most famous people on the planet. And if John Lennon says, I'd like to come on and co-host a show with you for a week, you're going to take that seriously. And there's ratings, press, they're not the producers of the Mike Douglas show were not unaware of who John Lennon was and who Yoko was. But what's extraordinary is there was an element of trust between both parties. Yoko and John trusted that Mike Douglas wouldn't make them look stupid, and Mike Douglas trusted that John and Yoko wouldn't make him look stupid. And that's exactly what happened. And that's really why we wanted to present these shows in this sort of modern frame, but let the shows speak for themselves, because you can see it happening across the 5 days that the tapings went in real time. You can see the comfort level and trust developing it. And at this moment, as I say in time, it's good to remind America and Americans that you can trust a bold idea. If you come in sort of, as Yoko, I'm sure, would say, in peace and harmony, you can get a lot done. And I think that's a very encouraging message right now. We're still the same country, and we should be reminded of what we're capable of.
Did Mike Douglas and the show receive a lot of pressure behind the
Nope.
scenes to
Nope,
not
no,
do this
no,
at
there,
all?
no. The only thing we could turn up is that Yoko wanted Jerry Rubin to be the first guest, I think, on the second show, and Mike wanted him farther down the roster, the producers, because they felt Jerry Rubin would frighten away their audience, and I don't think that was a misplaced sentiment. So the Douglas show won that round, but Jerry Rubin is still on the show.
In order to get this film made, I understand that you needed to get the approval of Yoko and Sean Lennon. Can you tell me a little bit about um, your work with them in order
Well, they just in the U.S. versus John Lennon, we had a very enjoyable, constructive relationship. So I knew that they were. It was not easy, but possible to work with them and what their creative parameters were. And when I outlined the film I wanted to make and how I wanted to make it with Sean, who passed it on to his mom, they were on board from the beginning. And their only notes, quote unquote, involved how much of the interviews with our other people we used. They wanted to see more of our chorus of guest members 50 years on. They really liked that part the best. So their comments were extremely helpful. And I think it's important because this is Yoko and John's work that they're on board with what we're doing. If we're republishing this and reframing it, it would be presumptuous of me not to work with them.
Absolutely. Can you tell me a little bit in terms of what you learned in your dealings with Sean in terms of what you've learned this week on television meant to them? Obviously, John Lennon did so many remarkable things in his lifetime with his solo work and his work with the Beatles. This is one moment, but watching the film, I just got this sense that this was a very personal, ambitious idea that he and Yoko had, and it must have meant a lot to them. Is that true from what you've learned?
Well, again, you see in real time what it meant to them. You see John being comfortable. You see John enjoying being a talk show host. He never looked better or sounded better. He was in great shape, totally honest, communicative, happy to answer dumb questions from the studio audience, rocking hard. So I think the actual experience was a real pleasure for them. So I'm not sure what the legacy or afterburn of that experience was for them, but they look back on it fondly. Do know that, which is why we wanted to work with Yoko. She remembers it vividly and remembers it fondly.
He was really the real deal. What's the most surprising thing that you encountered when you were going through all this footage for you personally?
Well, just to be honest with you, to see how good Mike Douglas was.
Yeah.
I didn't to see just how deftly he conducts as the ringmaster of this three-ring artistic circus was wonderful to watch. And I think he deserves all the credit in the world for enabling this and for conducting this so well and for making John and Yoko feel so comfortable in his living room. So that was my real big takeaway.
Tell me a little bit more about Chuck Berry. Uh, that's a very famous performance, and you really do get the sense that John Lennon had great respect for him. And the song that they did together, it seemed like a joyful experience. What a moment on the Mike Douglas show.
Well, the song, Chuck was a total fanboy, and Chuck met John, and John met Chuck for the very first time in the green room, probably 15 minutes before they did their performance together. So that's a moment in musical history. And John felt about Chuck the way that our guest felt meeting John Lennon, in awe. And you really see John just gushing. And because Chuck always just played with whatever band was around, he joined John's band, which at the time was Elephant's Memory, with Yoko Ono on percussion and with a microphone. So off to the races. And I think what's great about it is when Yoko does her Yoko thing, it Chuck is like, what the hell? And it's a great moment of rock and roll. It's what makes this appearance interesting. It's the best moment of rock and roll, I think, in any of these shows. And it stands out today. We're still talking about it. So good on you, Yoko.
Yeah, I loved in some of the performances how whoever was the guest would just be up there with the band, playing along or singing along, and even Mike Douglas was around. It was just a very very unusual assortment of people playing together, but there was a strong message in that. What do you think about those group performances in terms of what it says and what we can take away from that for today?
Well, again, it's a utopian vision. It's a lot of people with radical and differing views coming on this mainstream platform and all working overtime and on their best behavior to communicate with one another. I can't stress enough that message deserves to be heard again. And it is not a coincidence that the film is opening up next Wednesday or on Wednesday, October 9th, John Lennon's 84th birthday. So we want it out in theaters before the election so people can recapture the optimism. The question is, will we still need him when he's 84? The film provides an answer to that question.
And what is the number one thing that you hope that today's audiences take away from this movie?
Well, peace, love, Woodstock Nation, optimism, and basically what Americans are capable of when we try a little harder.
It really is an amazing document of a unique time period and a great group of people. It's funny, Ralph Nader is in the film and he's run for president. I mean, he's essentially banned from mainstream media today. What does it tell you that, like, he was allowed on this program back then, but today he can't even get on news
Well,
programs?
that's not true. He does a nationally syndicated radio show, which my radio station in Santa Cruz, California broadcasts. So Ralph's still very much out there doing his Ralph thing. And the fact that, if he's in any kind of doghouse, the fact that people still unfairly claim that he put George W. Bush into the White House. I know, I think Al Gore running the world's worst presidential campaign put George W. Bush. Remember, Al Gore didn't even carry his home state of Tennessee during that election. So it's unfair for people to blame Ralph. And Ralph is a brilliant, feisty, and still very wise 90 plus guy. And we're honored to have Ralph in our movie.
Oh no, I wasn't blaming him. I do have great respect, and I do know he's still active. What I was trying to say was that he's not frequently allowed on CNN, on MSNBC,
Well, he's an
on
old
Fo-
guy too. Come on, when your guy's in his 90s, they want the younger thing. He he he's served. He's a wise elder now, and wise elders often don't find their way on mainstream television. I don't think it's about Ralph. I think it's about ageism.
Wow. Okay. I've heard people say that he's not allowed on for his views sometimes.
No, I don't think so. I think it's straight ageism, and he's too much a deep thinker for our soundbite culture.
Well, that's equally bad.
Yeah.
But he's a big part of this movie, and he was a big part of the show. And this film is remarkable. Tell us again the name of the movie, where it's going to be seen at the festival and in other places.
Well, the key is Wednesday, October 9th, John Lennon's 84th birthday. Just go up to Google the title of the film, Daytime Revolution, Google the magic words Kino Lorber, Kinolorber, Daytime Revolution, Kino Lorber, and look for a theater near you. It's being shown one time. And we're trying to create the same happening and open up the Wayback Machine to 1972. So the Wayback Machine is open Wednesday night and it closes right up. So get your tickets in advance.
I want to highly recommend Daytime Revolution. Erik Nelson, thank you so much for joining me on the Sounds of Film.
My pleasure.